The first snow of the season came early that year, drifting down in soft spirals across the high ridges and settling like lace on the shoulders of the mountains. By dawn, the old pines stood heavy and hushed, and the river, swift and swollen with melt, carried the scent of cedar and distant thunder down through the valley. It was a land shaped by silence and stone, where nothing gentle lasted long unless it learned to endure. Mara had lived alone on the edge of it for 4 winters now, in a cabin her father built with his own hands before the sickness took him. Her mother had gone before that, lost to childbirth and buried under a cairn wrapped in fox pelts and sorrow. The years since had worn her lean and careful, her strength quiet as snowfall, but just as relentless. She kept a goat, 2 hens, and a black dog named Fen who never strayed far from her heels. She trapped for pelts, hunted by bow, and spoke to no one but the wind, unless she rode the 2-day trail to the trading post every other moon. The morning she found him, she'd gone to check her lines strung along the river bend, hoping for mink or muskrat. The sun was a pale smear behind the clouds, barely breaking the horizon, and the cold had a knife's edge. Fen growled low before she saw it, a tangle of cloth and limb caught against the rocks near the far shore, pale and still. She dropped her pack. The water was numbing, wicked with current and ice. She didn't think, only moved. Her boots filled fast, pulling her down with each step, but she pushed through, arms raw with cold, breath like fire in her lungs. When she reached him, he was face down, one arm wedged between boulders, his coat shredded and blood on his brow. She pulled him from the river with her bare hands, muscles straining against the weight of him, the slick of water and blood. He was half dead, limp as a drowned fawn. Still, she checked, his pulse was there, weak and staggered. She hauled him to shore, tore off her coat and pressed it to his chest, shouting for Fen who circled close and whining. She built fire with shaking fingers, teeth clacking so hard she bit her tongue. The heat took forever to catch, the kindling damp and stubborn, but it came. She stripped the soaked clothes from his frame and laid her own body beside his beneath blankets and pelts, sharing what warmth she could muster. His skin was marked with bruises and old scars, a map of violence and hard roads. His lashes were ice-frosted, and when he finally gasped, the sound was hoarse and animal. She whispered nonsense to keep him tethered, half lullaby, half prayer, as the wind screamed through the birches. He didn't speak that day, nor the next. Fever came quick, and she fought it with willow bark and wet cloths, anchoring him to the world with her hands and her will alone. In those hours, something ancient and wordless settled between them. On the 3rd morning, when his eyes opened, he looked at her like he was still drowning. She didn't ask his name, not yet. He would tell her when he was ready, or he wouldn't. The valley did not rush anything worth keeping. By the time he could sit upright without swaying, 2 weeks had passed and the snow had deepened into something permanent. It coated the roof of the cabin like a second skin and muffled all sound beneath a vast white hush. Mara moved through it like a shadow, tending the fire, boiling roots, salving wounds. She didn't press him for answers, didn't ask what sent him tumbling into the river half-dead and full of secrets. She knew well enough the weight men carried, the kind that didn't show until it bled out through the skin. He watched her always, quietly from the corner near the hearth where she'd made him a bed of fir branches and wool. His eyes followed her movements with a soldier's wariness, cataloging each gesture, every reach of her hand, the way she leaned into her work without complaint. It unsettled him. She could tell, this calm she wore like armor, but she let him have his silence. The first words he spoke came on the 15th night, his voice rough and low like a rusted hinge. "You should have let me go." Mara didn't look up from where she was mending a torn sleeve near the firelight. She drew the needle through, slow and steady. "I don't let go of what the river gives back," she said. He fell quiet again. A long time passed before he spoke once more, and when he did, it was only to ask for her name. "Mara." He repeated it like it had weight, like it mattered. Then he told her his, called her. No last name, no place he belonged to, just a single word wrapped in gravel and old pain. The days passed slower than the nights. When he grew strong enough to stand, she gave him her father's old coat and put him to work splitting wood. He limped still, favoring the leg torn up by the river rocks, but he didn't complain. He worked in silence, and she let him. Sometimes she caught him staring out across the trees, jaw set like a man waiting for a reckoning. Other times, she'd find him tracing the scars on his chest like they were words he'd once known and now forgot how to read. It wasn't affection, not yet. What grew between them was smaller than that stranger. It was in the way she poured his tea without asking, in the way he kept watch when she went to check the snares. It was in how they sat together at night, not speaking, sharing the silence like a third presence. One evening, she returned from the ridge with a brace of snowshoe hares and found him gone. The cabin door hung open, fire dwindled to embers. Panic struck her throat like a hawk's talon. She found him down by the river, standing knee-deep in the shallows, face tilted toward the mountains as if listening to something only he could hear. When she called his name, he didn't turn. She crossed the stones barefoot, the cold biting sharp, and stood beside him. "I thought maybe it would take me back," he said, voice hollow. "It already did," she answered. He looked at her then, truly looked. Something in his face softened, the hard lines gentled by the cold. That night he built the fire for her. And when they sat down, their shoulders brushed, neither pulled away. He hadn't yet told her what he was running from. But she'd seen the edge of a bullet wound between his ribs when she cleaned him. She'd seen the way he flinched at distant thunder, the way he never slept through the night. Whatever it was, it had teeth. And it hadn't finished hunting. Winter deepened its grip with every passing week, tightening around the valley like a noose made of frost. The cold grew cruel, bitter enough to crack stone, and the sky hung low and heavy with unfallen snow. The world shrank to the cabin and the breath between trees, and still Calder stayed. He slept by the hearth, rose before the sun, and moved through each day with quiet purpose. He learned the way of her routines, not by asking, but by watching. How she stored the roots in the cool corner behind the firs, how she tied her snowshoes with her teeth when her hands were numb. He began to meet her halfway, carrying the buckets before she reached for them, carving new trap stakes when hers began to splinter. Mara noticed, but said nothing. Trust, she knew, was not something you gave. It was something you earned in the hours no one else saw. Still, there were moments when his past flickered through like a stormlight behind clouds. The time he woke screaming, fists clenched as if gripping a rifle. The time she found him crouched behind the cabin, breathing hard, his eyes unfocused and wild. She didn't touch him then, just sat on the step, her presence steady, until he came back to himself. One morning, as the wind howled like wolves through the pines, she returned from checking the far snares and found him sharpening her skinning knife at the table. Not with the clumsy caution of someone learning, but with the muscle memory of a man who'd done it countless times before. "You a hunter?" she asked, setting her pack down with a thud. His hand paused, a beat passed. "No, not the kind that feeds anyone." She didn't ask more. Whatever had carved that answer into him, it wasn't a story fit for daylight. In the weeks that followed, a rhythm formed, something close to peace. They split their chores, shared their meals, read from her father's Bible not for prayer but for company. Calder took to carving wood in the evenings, shaping birds and antlered deer with the same quiet intensity he gave everything else. He gave her the first one, a small sparrow, wings tucked against its sides like it knew how cold the world could be. She placed it on the mantel. "Why a sparrow?" she asked. He shrugged. "They survive." Then came the tracks. Mara found them 3 days before thaw, a wide loop near the goat pen. Not coyote, not bear, men. 2 pairs, heavy boots, fresh enough to unsettle. She crouched beside them, her heart stammering in her chest, and when she looked up, Calder was already there behind her, jaw tight. "You know them?" she asked. He didn't answer, not with words, just nodded once, slow, and drew her inside. That night he unwrapped a bundle he'd hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside was a revolver, oiled and clean, and a bundle of ammunition tied in a red cloth. "I used to ride with them," he said, "used to be one of them." Mara didn't ask who them was. She didn't need to. She knew what kind of men left boots like that. Calder looked at her then, something brittle in his voice. "They'll come back." She nodded, "Then we'll be ready." They spent the next day setting snares of a different kind. Tripwires, false trails. She taught him how to notch the trees in her way, how to move silent through snow. He taught her how to reload in the dark. It wasn't fear she felt, it was something colder, clearer. She had lived alone for 4 winters. She made peace with the silence, with the aching nights and the long hunger. But she hadn't pulled him from that river just to lose him to what hunted him. This time, she would not be the one left behind. And when the men came, because they would, she'd make sure the valley kept what it had claimed. The thaw came slow, but sure, peeling back winter's hush with the creak of ice breaking on the river and the first wet drip from the eaves. Birds returned in fits, their cries sharp against the quiet. Beneath the snow, the ground bled brown and soft, and the smell of earth, dank, raw, awakening, rose like breath from a sleeping beast. Mara and Calder did not speak much those days. What needed saying had already settled between them, heavy and solid. They trained in the still hours, Calder showing her where to aim, how to wait, how to read the wind through the trees. Mara, in turn, showed him how to disappear into the valley, how to listen not just for sound, but for the absence of it. They moved like water around each other, without friction. 3 days after the first crocus pushed through the snowmelt by the goat pen, Fen growled low at the cabin door. Not a warning growl, but a signal, deep in the chest, the way he'd once growled at a mountain cat before it even showed its eyes. Calder rose with his hand already at his belt. Mara slipped her blade into the fold of her coat, heart steady, steps quieter than a fox's breath. They saw the smoke first, faint and wrong, curling beyond the ridgeline near the east edge of the valley. Mara knew that place. A linta there she used once in summer, long fallen into disrepair. Too far from the trap lines for any traveler to find by accident. They tracked from downwind, silent and low, until the trees thinned and the ground opened wide to a clearing lit by low fire. 2 men, both wiry, ragged, but armed. One paced like a wolf too long caged, the other lounged with a bottle, face upturned to the weak sun. Calder's expression didn't change, but something in him drew taut. She could feel it radiating from him like heat off stone. "That them?" she asked low. "Some of them," he said. "There were 5. Her mouth tightened. She touched his arm once, brief. Then they withdrew, melted back into the trees. That night they planned. The men weren't just hunting Calder. They were waiting, setting route. A camp meant permanence or at least expectation. Mara knew how to be patient. She taught the valley that patience, the slow setting of traps in thawed soil, the camouflage of motionless limbs in brush, the choreography of ambush built over days, not hours. They moved like ghosts, never seen, never heard. Until the first man vanished. They took him without blood. Calder crept through the darkness like something returned from death and struck with the silence of a falling hawk. Bound him, gagged him, hauled him blind through underbrush to the hollow beside the falls where the echo covered all sound. The second man came looking 2 days later. He didn't make it far. By the time Mara dragged his body back to the cabin, Calder was already waiting, eyes rimmed with shadow, face unreadable. They didn't kill the first man, not yet. They waited until he spoke. It wasn't confession he offered, but boast. How Calder had once led them through Colorado, how he knew every safe path from border to fort, how they'd raided silver lines and ranch stock and wagons heavy with federal pay. "He was our ghost," the man said through broken teeth, "until he up and vanished." Mara watched Calder as he listened. No denial, no flinch, only the slow coiling of his fists. When the man had no more words, Mara stepped away, let Calder decide what should be done. He didn't ask her to look away. He didn't ask for forgiveness either. After it was done, Calder stood at the river's edge a long while, water running crimson in eddies around the rocks. Mara approached, not touching him, only matching his stillness. "They won't stop," he said. "Then we don't stop," she answered. He turned to her then, something raw and wide in his face. "I didn't want to bring this here." "But you did," she said, "and now it's ours to finish." He nodded, and in that nod was something deeper than thanks, something like vow. They burned the lean-to, buried what was left in the thawed ground, left no trail, no sign. The valley breathed easier for a while after that. But Mara knew peace could be a quiet lie, and some men hunted not for need, but for pride. And pride, once wounded, was the kind that never healed. Spring came hard that year. The valley, long buried beneath winter's hush, stirred with a suddenness that cracked trees at the root. Rain fell in furious bursts, swelling the river until it churned black and wild, stripping bark from driftwood and tearing loose the banks. The thaw unearthed more than soil. Bones surfaced near the ridge. Old snares once lost were found twisted and rusted, and the air smelled of rot and blooming both. Mara planted her garden in silence, hands deep in the waking earth. Calder repaired the cabin's eastern wall, where snow had bowed the beams. They moved with the tired precision of people who had survived not just winter, but something colder, something meaner. They spoke more now, but only in the ways that mattered. He asked if she preferred to salt her meat before drying. She asked how he slept. The answers were often short but full. What bound them was no longer just necessity. It was something else, earned, weighty, built in the small work of survival. One night when the storm rolled low and slow through the valley, she woke to find Calder standing in the doorway, looking out into the dark. "They'll come," he said, voice steady. "The others." "How many?" she asked, already reaching for her boots. "3, maybe more." She joined him at the threshold, the warmth of sleep still clinging to her skin. The storm wasn't overhead yet, but it pressed against the horizon like a held breath. Fen stood bristled beside them, eyes narrowed toward the tree line. "They won't ask," Calder said. "They'll shoot." Mara nodded. She wasn't afraid of men who didn't know the land. The valley was hers, and Calder's now too, though he didn't say it. She saw it in how he walked the trails without thought, how he touched the bark of certain trees like they were old friends. The land had marked him, accepted him. She would not let it be taken. The next days were spent shaping the terrain to their will. Calder dug deadfalls, shored up the blind behind the rise. Mara set signal fires in hollowed logs, soaked in pitch, to be lit with a single match. They moved in different arcs but met at dusk, their bodies tired, their hands stained. It was not fear that kept them close those nights. It was something older. Each gesture meant something now, the way she brushed snowmelt from his sleeve, the way he waited until she crossed the stream before moving on. No promises were made, none were needed. The first sign came with the crows. 3 of them wheeling high above the north ridge, calling in that sharp, throaty way crows do when they've seen something not meant for their eyes. Then the smoke, small, quick to vanish but not unnoticed. Mara and Calder waited until dark to climb the southern ridge. From there they saw them. 3 men, maybe 4, gathered near the old elk path. One had a rifle slung lazy over his shoulder. Another smoked like he hadn't eaten in days. They were restless, that much was clear. Not scouts, hunters. Calder watched without blinking. "They'll come at dawn," he said. "Then we'll be waiting." They returned to the cabin in silence, the moon just a sliver over the trees. Inside, she boiled water, crushed dried yarrow with the heel of her hand. Calder cleaned the barrel of his revolver with reverence. When he was done, he looked up at her. "I didn't believe in things lasting," he said. "Not after what I've done, not after who I've been." Mara met his gaze, the storm inside her quiet, deep as the river that had tried to take him. "I don't need you clean," she said, "just true." He stood then, crossed the room, took her hand, calloused and cold, and held it without trembling. That night they lay together, not with hunger but with gravity, the way roots meet underground, the way warmth pools after a long freeze. The wind rose, rain tapped soft against the roof. And in the hush that followed, she knew, whatever came, she would not face it alone. The morning broke not with sun, but with mist, thick and silver, curling through the valley like a living thing. The trees loomed shadowless, the air heavy with wet pine and loam. Even the birds kept quiet. It was a stillness born of waiting, of breath held before the break. Mara woke before first light. Calder was already up, standing near the cabin's edge, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the goat pen. He wore his revolver low, loose at the hip, her father's coat drawn tight against the damp. Fen paced beside him, ears flat, tail stiff with warning. "They're coming," Calder said, voice low. Mara nodded. She strapped her knife to her thigh, slid the rifle over her shoulder, and met him at the edge of their clearing. No words passed between them. What they needed to say was in the way she touched his arm once, briefly, before slipping into the brush. She took the east side, weaving silent through the undergrowth, feet sure on soft ground. Calder moved west. The valley swallowed them both. The first shot cracked the air just after dawn. Not theirs. A warning or a mistake, it didn't matter. The game had begun. The men moved loud through the mist. They didn't know the land. Mara watched from a low ridge, breath steady, as one of them stepped into her line of sight, turning in slow confusion. She fired once. He fell like a sack of grain, no cry, no struggle. Then it all broke loose. Gunfire tore the hush apart. Calder's revolver barked twice from the western flank. Another cry rang out, short and sharp. Fen charged through the underbrush, teeth bared, a black streak of fury. Mara circled, quick and low, drawing them in. She'd set the false trail well, mud prints, broken branches, the hint of movement where there was none. One man followed, stumbling into the trap she'd rigged at the river bend. A snare caught his leg. He went down hard. She was on him before he could scream. Only one made it close to the cabin. He came at a dead run, boots skidding in the thaw, rifle raised, but Calder was waiting there just inside the doorway. His shot rang like thunder, point-blank, clean. The man pitched forward, face down in the snow-patched earth. Then silence. Mara stepped out from the trees, hands shaking now that it was done. Calder met her halfway. He was bleeding from a graze along his temple, but his eyes were clear. "All of them?" she asked. He nodded, for now. They buried the bodies on the ridge, deep beneath stone and ash. Calder carved no markers. The wind would take care of the rest. After, they didn't speak, not until the fire was lit again and the smell of strong tea filled the cabin. Calder sat at the table, head bowed, hands folded. Mara stood over the hearth, watching the flame. "They'll send more," he said. "Maybe." He looked up at her then. "You can still leave." Mara turned, crossed the room, laid her hand over his. "I stayed through the river, through the blood, through the storm," she said. "You think I'm leaving now?" Calder's breath hitched, just once. She leaned down, pressed her forehead to his, and for the first time, he let her hold him. When summer came, it came green and slow and wide. Wildflowers crept along the cabin's steps. The goats fattened. The hens laid without fuss. The valley, scarred and silent, opened like a wounded thing learning trust. They built a new fence together, replanted what the storm had taken. Sometimes Calder rode out beyond the ridge, came back with deer or news of no one. Mara taught him how to tell the sky by smell alone. He made her queen of his valley, not with a crown, but with his steadiness, his sweat. The way he knelt to place seeds in her garden like planting was prayer. And she ruled not with command, but with presence, with quiet love that needed no name. They never left. The world beyond the mountains kept spinning, cruel and distant. But in that high place, where the river ran cold and the sparrows nested low in the firs, two souls built something that even death had failed to wash away. A life, a home, each other.